as treatment for malnutrition that resulted, as the advertising literature of the 1930s claimed, from the after effects of civil war and Tsarist despotism. This is the logo of the meat processing plant that produced this kielbasa. And this logo was recycled in the 1990s along with an advertising slogan that pointed out that the Mikoyan meat processing plant had been a supplier to the Kremlin since 1933. This is an advertising slogan that worked in 1999. This is a box of tea that was recreated under the imaginative slogan, "The same old tea," and did very well. And this is what all that nostalgia advertising managed to obscure. By creating a new past that was free of anxiety, a past of plenty, rather than the past of poverty that we actually all had. The most ambitious brand recreation was the construction of a high-rise building that claims to be the tallest residential structure in Europe. You might think by looking at this that this was constructed in the 1930s or 40s. This is actually a 1990s building that went up in Moscow. It looks an awful lot like Stalin-era skyscrapers. Its television and radio advertising had a voiceover that mimicked Soviet newscast and called it a special assignment building. This is a very odd expression, and it is especially odd because it originates with a phrase that was used to call the house where the Tsar's family was interned and executed in 1918. That was the last special assignment building. But still, it projected a kind of safety, and it managed to return people mentally to the era of stagnation, which was a mind-bogglingly stable era in the Soviet Union. This is the 1970s and 80s. And this is because Soviet propaganda addresses the greatest need of the anxious culture, a need for paranoid clarity, an understanding of who the enemy is, and reassurance that we have the might to win. It projects the promise of making order out of chaos and collective strength out of individual fear. And the only prerequisite is that the fear has to grow with every new campaign, with every new election. The 2000 election brought Vladimir Putin to power by capitalizing on the fear caused by the deadly apartment block explosions in Moscow and the south of Russia, and by building on the mobilization for a renewed war in Chechnya. And then something that I think was inevitable happened, which is that ever greater anxiety was required, and Chechen terrorists, real or imagined, were no longer enough, even with all the atrocities that they were apparently capable of perpetrating. So a bigger, more abstract, and most important, an external threat was necessary to justify ever greater mobilization. So here we see an example of this mobilization. This is Vladimir Putin on the left, speaking to a group of Nashi activists. Nashi is a Kremlin youth group. The name translates as ours. And we have a historical photo on the right, just to remind us that Russia and even the Soviet Union were not the only countries where the sort of propaganda was used, these sorts of images were used to counter public anxiety and fear. So what we have on the right, as you may have guessed, is actually not Soviet propaganda. This is Nazi photos. And on the left, we have Nashi, the Kremlin youth movement. These are all photos from the 30s. They were used for the same purposes and historically were as successful. So now we're left with two questions. First, who is the enemy the great big enemy that inspires such fear and requires such mobilization? This is a Nashi march in Moscow in 2006. This is a Nazi march. So this is the answer. This is the great big enemy that inspires such great fear. This is one of a series of 2003 posters that actually preceded the war in Iraq, remarkably. So the second question is, and I think this is part of the answer, why should America care in 2007 that Russia is dusting off the rusted tools of a failed empire? And the answer is because propaganda works. It works especially well in a closed system, a system where the rulers are reading their own newspapers and watching their own television. They're the ones with whom this fear originates, and they're the ones on whom the resulting response works best. To be blunt, I think that President Putin has come to believe his own television anchors, who tell him that the Western world is the aggressive enemy, and only a revitalized and aggressive Russian military will protect the country and him personally from this threat. So this is what we see. I'll close with a short Russian newscast.
Полеты наших бомбардировщиков в Арктике, над Атлантикой и Тихим океаном будут продолжаться, чтобы не говорил по этому поводу Вашингтон.
And this is what we get. And this is Vladimir Putin.
Ответить асимметрично, чтобы все поняли, что да, система противовоздушной, противоракетной обороны есть, но она в отношении России бессмысленна, потому что у нас есть такое оружие, которое легко преодолевает. Вот мы по этому пути и пойдем. Это дешевле для нас.
Thank you.
Thank you, Masha. Well, now we turn to China, and before saying a few words, watch the screen. You'll see some Chinese propaganda posters and some North Korean propaganda posters, which I stumbled across at an art show in London and snapped up, and you'll get a sense of the graphic strength of these representations, even though the message sometimes may sound a little silly. So watch the screens. Well, that was, of course, the East is Red.